Chapter 14 The Four Temptations. Akira was dead. She knew it. The time core had malfunctioned, and the ship was destroyed. That was the only way to account for how everything around her simply blinked out of existence as soon as the time jump started. As soon as she realized the Archangel vanished, Akira closed her eyes and waited to die. But as 1 second after another ticked by, Akira could still feel her own heartbeat. She could still breathe and sense the movement of something above her. Slowly, she opened her eyes. It took Akira a few moments to get her bearings. She had arrived in a place that was both foreign and strangely familiar. She stood on the precipice, at the edge of this strange new realm for a moment, overlooking a vast ocean of swirling color and shadow. Then Akira remembered. The ship was gone. She looked around in a panic, trying to figure out where the Archangel had gone. She could see for miles upon miles of this strange new world, but she couldn't find the angel. Around her, this strange place went on for as far as the eye could see. The ground itself was unremarkable, almost nondescript in comparison to the skies above. A roiling, swirling storm raged above. Great clouds, tinged in colors of indigo and violet, collided together while bolts of lightning cracked and snapped in the heavens. The longer Akira beheld this fantastic realm, the more she became lost in it. For the first time since she woke up, her mind began to wander. As soon as her thoughts strayed, a path seemed to open up before her, cutting through the azure fog banks that surrounded her. Akira took a step forward, or at least she tried to. She found herself chaotically sailing forward through the air before crashing down at high speed. In that moment, Akira completely lost her bearings. Sitting up again, she suddenly found herself being overwhelmed by fear and anxiety. She had no idea where she was. She couldn't see or hear any of her companions, and she was all alone in this place. Around her, the strange properties of this realm were becoming more and more noticeable. Akira was aware, vaguely at first, that wisps of some kind of energy were filling the air around her like vapors. No, not just any kind of energy. Psionic energy. This place, whatever it was made entirely from it. Raw and unrefined mental willpower, separated from any conscious mind. Now that Akira knew what was around her, this made her believe even more that she had somehow died when the Archangel reached the end of time. The crack and peal of thunder caught Akira's attention, and she looked up. Above her, a tempestuous storm cloud lit up with fantastic flashes of light before a titanic creature emerged from it. Almost larger than Akira could comprehend, the celestial being was made entirely out of psionic energy. Screaming, Akira backed away as a second being, equally massive and built like its counterpart, thundered onto the scene from her right. Before her eyes, the colossal apparitions came together and began to fight, each blow sending out bolts of lightning in all directions. Utter panic washed over Akira as she turned and tried to put as much space between herself and the battling giants as possible. But now that she looked around, Akira realized that more than one duel like this was playing out here. This nightmarish psionic world was shrouded in rumbling storms of psionic violence. Akira ran and ran and ran until she couldn't run anymore. Legs weak, chest heaving, she collapsed. She'd come to rest on a ridgeline above a dark valley, whose bottom was hidden by shadows. Exhausted, Akira found herself wishing for water. No sooner had the thought crossed her mind Then she became aware of a stream flowing nearby. The gentle sound of moving water calmed her, too. Akira caught her breath and looked up again. Where there was nothing just a few moments ago, a small creek now wound its way past her and into the dark valley. When she reached it, Akira realized the water was cooler and fresher than any she'd ever had in her life. Refreshed, she stood up and tried to get her bearings again. Strangely enough, Akira could see a path. She wasn't sure if it was the same path she tried to follow earlier or a different one, but nonetheless it was there. Curiosity got the better of her, and she started to walk down the beaten path, down into the dark valley. After a short distance, Akira sensed something approaching her. Looking back, she saw a large flock of, well, she wasn't sure what they were. Thousands of individual points of light were swarming and swirling through the air like a cloud of insects. Akira got the powerful sense that she could not let these things get close to her. Summoning up her own willpower, she raised a psionic shield and held it to her back as she started to jog along the path, looking for someplace to hide. Inside the Valley of Shadows, things were just as strange. Here, Akira encountered even more life forms made of psionic energy. Thanks to her own gift, she could perceive and sense each one and was disturbed to learn that none of these creatures were intelligent. They were much closer in nature to animals than humans. Meanwhile, the swirling host of lights was still in pursuit. Akira could feel her telepathic shield getting hotter and hotter as they grew near. Darting between two elephantine creatures, she spotted a place where the shadows of the valley seemed to rise off the ground and take on a tangible shape. A jagged wall of darkness took shape, and in that wall there was an opening. At least, that's what Akira called it. A yawning chasm opened up in the dark barrier, and Akira threw herself inside of it. It was like stepping into a cave. Everything around her went dark, and the shimmering, flickering flock of lights refused to follow her any further. Yet, as Akira watched them leave from her dark sanctuary, she slowly noticed that something behind her was reflecting a lot of light. She turned around and saw something that was absolutely mesmerizing. In the back of the cave was a flat, smooth surface. Whatever it was, it acted like a mirror, reflecting Akira's likeness back at her. The mirror itself stretched from floor to ceiling, almost 30 feet tall. But the reflective surface was damaged. Something had struck the mirror and broken it. Long cracks ran along the surface like a spider web, turning what would have been one giant mirror into thousands of smaller ones. An incalculable number of human girls looked out of the broken mirror towards the lone person in the cave. Some of them bent or bulged. Others were seemingly incomplete, cut off by a fracture in the reflection. And the longer Akira looked at these reflections, the less like herself some of them seemed to be. Many of her reflections wore different clothes. A few were older, some younger. Yet they all moved as she moved, none the same. Then, Akira saw one of her own reflections that looked like it was injured. Taking a step closer to the mirror, she realized that one of her many reflections had been stabbed through the chest. The mirror Akira grabbed at the crystal sword sticking out of her chest, then screamed shrilly before it suddenly vanished from the broken mirror. Clutching her own chest, breathing heavily, Akira's sense of wonder was replaced by a second wave of panic. She tried to run out of the cave, only to find that the entrance was gone. The broken mirror was no longer flat. It curved around Akira until meeting itself behind her. She was encircled on all sides by distorted and discordant reflections of herself. One particular reflection, An older Akira, who wore a business suit and stood in front of the UN Secretary General's desk, folded her arms and said, "Do you think that's air you're breathing now?" Finally, Akira broke. She fell to the ground and curled up into a ball, holding her hands to her temples and keeping her eyes shut as she whispered out loud, pleading to whoever was listening, "Go away! Make it stop! Go away! Disappear!" But the nightmare did not end. She did not wake up. Akira began silently wishing for someone, anyone, to help her. She wanted to leave this horrible place, and in that moment, she was willing to pay any price to get out. The cave was dark and silent. Yet after a moment, Akira became aware of some kind of movement on the periphery. There was someone or something in the cave with her. Before she could react, a pair of warm and gentle hands took her by the shoulder. A voice, equally kind, spoke to Akira. "You are safe here." Akira's eyes snapped open, and she looked around at the strange thing. Even though the apparition was right next to her, she could not see it very clearly. Yet the vague, human-like shape was impossible to look away from. For some reason, Akira found this entity to be strangely attractive, to the point that her panic died away with each moment she spent looking at it. And this was where another aspect of the psionic world made itself known. Akira had never been to this place before, but for some reason, perhaps related to the fact that this place was built from psionic energy, Akira instantly knew what this thing was called. The Instrument of Desire gently rubbed Akira's shoulders, relaxing her. Blinking her eyes, Akira tried to fully understand what she was looking at. Each time her vision came back into focus, the Instrument of Desire would slightly change its appearance, taking on more definitive features and looking more and more like a very specific person. Akira wanted to ask why the Instrument of Desire was changing itself to look like Rafi Bakir, but before she could speak a word, it acted first. Suddenly, Akira found herself intertwined with the Instrument of Desire in a passionate embrace. For a few short moments, Akira tried to resist and force the creature to let go, but her will to fight was sapped away as the Instrument of Desire gently placed its warm hands on her neck and chest, causing a sudden and powerful sensation of pleasure to paralyze her. The psionic life form twisted and coiled itself around her body, mind, and soul, all the while whispering in her ear, "You will have everything you desire, and everything you will ever desire." Each and every time the instrument touched her body, Akira's mind went numb from the intense waves of pleasure and satisfaction, and she was being touched and held and caressed all over. She felt like she was back in Rafi's arms on Kauai. The Instrument of Desire only wanted what was best for her. It wanted to guide Akira, to direct her ambitions and dreams. From somewhere in the furthest, most distant corner of Akira's consciousness, a nervous feeling of doubt made itself known. Surely, this could not be some kind of gift. There must be some cost, some payment due. The Instrument of Desire scoffed at the notion. The cost? A small matter, little more than a cover fee. All Akira had to do was accept the Instrument of Desire into her heart. It was confident she would say yes. How could she possibly not say yes? Akira tried to gather her thoughts, to think rationally for just a moment while she was being smothered in love and affection. Instead, a deep-seated fear came to the forefront of her mind. She imagined herself far in the future. She had successfully managed to rewrite history to create a perfect future. In this new timeline, she ran to Rafi Bakir, but upon seeing her, Rafi rejected Akira. She had spent so much of her life traveling through time that she had grown old and ugly. Instead of staying with the woman who bent the universe for his sake, Rafi chose to love a younger, completely different person who was born in this new timeline. No, Akira could not. She would not allow this to pass. She wrapped her arms around the instrument and held it as close as she possibly could. And Akira could feel snake-like tendrils of psionic energy wrapping around her heart. Then Akira and the instrument of desire lost themselves in a sea of bliss. For how long, Akira didn't know, as she learned that the passage of time was a foreign concept to the creatures of the Shroud. When Akira woke, the instrument of desire was gone, and she was once again in the cave. But there was something different, not just with her surroundings, but with herself as well. Akira felt as though she was brimming with newfound confidence. In that moment, she felt as though she could have twisted any man or woman around her thumb with but the smallest of efforts. And she also felt a new willingness to put this willpower to the test. But there was another change she needed to take note of first. The cave was illuminated. Dozens of shimmering orbs of light hung in midair, their gentle light reflected off the many surrounding mirrors until Akira felt as though she was standing in a field of stars, like a goddess of old with the universe laid out around her. But there was a soft sound reaching her. Somewhere, either close by or very far away, Akira could hear a low rustling, as though dozens or hundreds of voices were all speaking at the same time. She looked around, trying to see exactly where the voices were coming from. But the instant Akira focused her attention on the source of the sound, silence fell. It seemed as though the voices knew she was listening. "Hello?" Akira called out. "Is someone there? Can you help me?" Then, in reply, there came hundreds of voices, all saying the same thing, but sounding discordant nonetheless. "We are the whisperers in the void. You seek knowledge and answers. We are privy to all whispered in secrecy, from one mortal to another." Akira couldn't see the whisperers. Their voices seemed to be coming from all around, almost as though the swirling galaxy of light around her was the body of this new creature. When the whisperers spoke, Akira could hear a sense of urgency in their tone. "We hear and see everything that is meant to be concealed or hidden away. We know details of the universe older than your home world. We harbor knowledge that is impossible to acquire through science or religion. We know the secrets thousands tried to take to their graves. We know the exact location of everything and everyone that is hidden. You need us." No matter how Akira looked at the situation, the whisperers in the void were right. Her plan to rewrite history and create a better future would require knowledge and access to secrets. But she wondered if the whisperers in the void would attempt to extract a toll from her, as did the instrument of desire. into your consciousness, the whisperers told Akira. It is a trivial matter. You will barely even notice our presence. When Akira hesitated, the whisperers spoke again, in a tone that conveyed the sense that time was short. Knowledge itself is incapable of harming anyone. What you choose to do with that knowledge determines how dangerous it is, to yourself or anyone else. Finally, Akira decided to accept the offer. In an instant, the universe around her began to unfurl and open like a book, and she was plunged into a vast ocean of knowledge. She drank information as though it was manna from heaven, and it was all that stood between herself and death. It would take just a few moments, but then Akira finally began to understand where she was and the true nature of this place. Akira was deep inside of the Shroud. It was a realm of pure thought, made from psionic energy and existing well outside of the normal universe. The psionic energy itself was drawn from the emotions of all intelligent life, and the life forms who resided here had a much deeper and more intimate understanding of psionics than any mortal could ever hope to achieve. Akira understood that her arrival here was no happy accident, nor was it the product of chance. Just before the Archangel had crossed through the end of time, something had seized the ship and pulled it in here. Akira cast herself about the Shroud. Even though her eyes were physically limited, there was now no limit to her perception. There it was. The Archangel was trapped in a dimension of fear and anxiety. Here, ethereal beings, similar to the ones who had once conquered Earth, gathered around the space plane, regarding it with nervous apprehension. Akira burst free of the caged galaxy and started making her way towards the space plane. Now that she understood the Shroud, she could take full advantage of its nature, crossing tens of thousands of miles in a single bound, while abstract thoughts and concepts hit her and shattered apart like snowflakes. Now that Akira could understand exactly what she'd gotten into, a whole new wave of ideas were starting to burst into her mind like fireworks. She could see and comprehend so many new ways to reshape the past with her newfound powers and knowledge. Possibilities and outcomes were laying themselves out before Akira's mind as though she could construct whole new timelines through sheer willpower alone. But then, Akira realized that many of these ideas were not her own. They belonged to a new presence. The composer of strands welcomed her to the plains of creation with genial familiarity. It didn't really speak to her with words, but instead by planting concepts, visions, and ideas into her mind. These powerful sparks of ideas, seeds of thought, and concepts of the future were inserted into Akira's consciousness with such smoothness and gentleness that she assumed these ideas had always been there. The composer of strands regarded Akira with a curious expression. Both the composer and Akira knew that to rewrite history and build a perfect future would require a very long and arduous journey. Akira's human body was frail and limited. Her physical form could be changed, improved, perfected, if only she would take the composer into her flesh. The composer of strands awaited her answer patiently. As Akira thought over the offer, the composer looked at her like a doting father waiting on his child. and it didn't have to wait long. Akira would be young, healthy, and strong for as long as it took to create the perfect future. She could not have seen the downsides to this deal because of how focused she was on a plan to use these new powers to accomplish her goal. Determined to recover her spaceplane and carry on to the end of time, Akira tried to press on, but found her way blocked. She stood on the border of a domain of dark thoughts. Here, the ill will of all sentient life could be found. Murderous intent manifested as noxious black haze, while malice and contempt seeped across the ground like the growth of some repulsive fungus. And standing within a cloud of blind rage, there was a monster. Unlike the other three creatures, this one had actively sought Akira out. She could sense its immense hunger and greed, and she could see all of its nightmare-inducing features that would have made Akira scream and run away if she had seen it before the other three. This was the Eater of Worlds, and it wanted to devour her. It did not mince words. It would feed on Akira, and in return, it would teach her to use fear, anger, and hunger as weapons that could overcome any foe. It was impatient to begin, and so was she. What happened next was an almost unspeakable horror. The Eater of Worlds lunged at Akira, who instinctively raised her hands to defend herself. A psionic shield flickered to life around Akira, and for exactly 2 seconds, she held off the Eater of Worlds. But then her defenses fell, and the creature descended upon her with gruesome and painful violence. Akira screamed with agony until she couldn't scream anymore as the Eater of Worlds tore at her flesh and snapped her bones. But suddenly, and without warning, it was all over. Perhaps, at the beginning of all this, Akira would have been shocked to see that after being savaged, mutilated, and partially eaten by the Eater of Worlds, her body was now surprisingly intact. There wasn't as much as a scratch anywhere on her. When Akira realized and understood that she had successfully formed a covenant with a fourth denizen of the Shroud, she threw her head back and laughed. A stilted, psychopathic laugh that didn't suit a teenage girl. By the time she reached the Archangel, Akira was happy that this detour had happened. She was now vastly stronger and more powerful with the gift than ever before, to the point where she dared to wonder if she might be taken for a god back in normal space. Inez Vasquez, Scarlett Freeman, and Ingrid Siajotso all raised their voices to cheer at the sight of Akira as she approached. The ship and its crew were adrift in a sea of complacency, the surface flat and undisturbed. But as Akira approached, the smiles fell from the faces of her three friends. And in that moment, Akira realized something. All three of her companions could plainly see that something about Akira had changed, that she was no longer the same person they left Earth with. Akira could feel the sensation of fear spreading from one person to the next. It moved like a plague. But there was another feeling, a worry. Akira could feel it being pushed to the back of her companions' minds. It was the same one that nagged at the back of her own consciousness. There was still one unanswered question. Akira still did not know who or what had pulled her into the Shroud in the first place. Looking around at her friends, she felt supremely confident that they weren't going anywhere. Akira turned her thoughts inward and began to project psionic energy into the shroud around her. She felt into every part of this strange world, right up to the distant border where a nation of extra-dimensional people waged wars that consumed whole galaxies. Then, after a few minutes of searching, she found it. The fifth presence. And at the same moment, it found her. Once more, reality itself began to warp and bend. Akira screamed as she suddenly beheld the vast entirety of creation within her field of view and saw herself in relation to it, infinitesimal and inconsequential. Time was dead and meaning had no meaning. Suddenly, in a moment of painful clarity, the nature of her existence was laid bare. A multiverse where thousands of galaxies, just like this one, were locked in endless cycles of conflict. It begins, it ends, and then it begins again. Each time with trillions of lives in the balance. So it is, a voice whispers, and so it shall always be. And then the presence revealed itself. Even though Akira had already met the Eater of Worlds, and even though she possessed the incalculable knowledge of the Whisperers in the Void, nothing could have prepared her for this. Horror. Horror has a face, and it was the face of the end of the cycle. Even with her newfound strength and power, Akira knew that in comparison, she was but a mote of dust. The ageless, infinite, and omniscient hellspawn in front of her was the closest thing this universe had to a god. And she was beneath it. So incomprehensibly far beneath the end of the cycle. So when the end of the cycle turned its attention upon Akira, she stood rooted to the spot by pure terror, knowing that at any moment, this thing could snuff her out with the smallest and weakest of efforts. Its words entered Akira's mind as plain and clear as if they had always been there. It is not yet